Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers. I thank everybody that's involved with this process because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Good afternoon. My name is David Witherington Stewart. I'm 85 years old, a widower. My wife died in 1999, and I write novels. And I have written 5 published novels to date. And what I'm going to do today is share some of my experience, some of the lessons that I've learned from writing those novels for anyone else who might be interested in what the methodology is to go about writing a novel. I have a PowerPoint to basically explain the process to you, and I'll go through it kind of step by step, what I learned. So could we show the PowerPoint, please? Yes, writing a novel, that's the title of this particular talk that I'm going to give right now, and it's my experience with 5 published novels. Next slide, please. Okay, the first novel that I wrote, which I published in 2009, was Psychic Redemption. And I actually began with a different premise, but I really started with a character also. But the premise for the novel ended up being that the spirit of this girl, 16 years old, who had been killed when she had a baby, and before she ever saw the baby, comes back and possesses a paramedic, Bonnie McConnell, in order to look for the baby that she never got to see. And she does know that it's a girl, and that's all that she knows. So she and Bonnie, the whole adventure is looking for who was her daughter and where is she now. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, actually, this novel, like others, began with a profile of the character. And for example, in Angel of Mortality, the most recent novel that I've published, I have 4 main characters, 4 point of view characters, actually 2 main characters. But the protagonist, the real main character, is Raisa Ilyushkin. She is a scientist, a biophysicist, and she graduated from Lomonosov University up in Russia. But she was born in Ukraine, in Avdiivka, which, if you're familiar with it right now, is being bombarded heavily by the Russians. And she is currently 11 years old. But the time the book takes place, she's getting close to 30. And the protagonist in this is Stepan Pavlovich, who they thought was killed, but he was the boss of Bratva, which is the Russian mafia, and is now the boss of an international crime syndicate. The other 2 characters that work with Raisa are the person she eventually marries, Damir Pelemachuk, and the head of the Secret Service for Kyrgyzstan, which is where her lab is located, Chopin Nogayeva. So you need to profile these characters and understand them. I did 7 rewrites on Angel Immortality, and with each rewrite, I got to know Raisa and Stepan and Demir and Shelpan much better. So by the time I actually published, they were like friends that I could sit down and talk to. Not that Stepan was that friendly, by the way. Next slide, please. So how do I go about writing a novel? What do I actually do? And basically, a novel comes in my methodology, 10 parts. There's an opening, a middle, and an end, which is the way you would probably imagine any story being. And the first part, the beginning, is really how do you get the reader to read the second page? If somebody picks up a book and looks at the first page and it's not interesting, they won't go to the second page. So you have to put something on the first page that really brings the reader in. What is the story about? Who are the characters? What's going on? What's the mystery? What is the question? What is the action? All of these things. So there's the hook, and then there basically is the inciting incident, which is what sets off the story, what makes the story start. And then there's the key event, which the key event is really not just what starts the story, but what brings the main character into the story. When do they start being actively involved? What makes them actively involved? So you have to get through those things. Why is your person doing what they're doing? What are they doing? And what makes it interesting? What makes it different? So then by the time you have all that set up and you basically have something going on that the key character has to pursue, then you get to the middle. Well, when you get to the middle, if everything just goes smoothly, you could write it in a page. But of course, nothing goes smoothly for the main character. The main character has problems, and these are called pinch points. There's basically 2 pinch points that I try and aim for. One is in the middle of the middle, more or less. From the middle of the point from the end of the first part to the middle of the second part. And at that point, what happens is the protagonist, Stepan Pavlovich, in the case of Angel Immortality, and basically Leroy Green in Serious Consequences, they step forward and they do something unexpected and they put the main character into a real bind. So now she's got a problem. She's got something to really solve because now the main character and the protagonist are basically engaged. And this goes on through until the middle of the second part. And in the middle of the second part, the character has kind of to solve the problem. They decided what to do, and they start taking real action and doing something to solve the problems that they're facing. But halfway through the second part of the middle, the protagonist realizes, hey, these people are going to beat me. The antagonist realizes the protagonist is going to beat me if I don't do something drastic. So he'll take drastic action. And when that happens, then the protagonist has to come around and respond to it. And this goes on until the end of the middle, which comes down to the climax. When do the protagonist and the antagonist basically meet face to face or meet the situation face to face? And they have it out. And of course, usually the protagonist, the hero or the heroine, wins. But it takes an effort. And like in Angel Immortality, it's right about the last page. There's a big wave coming, and it's going to sink Raisa's boat, and she's going to die with her baby. But of course, the nanoborg that she has invented saves her life. So that's the way the book kind of ends. And then after the book ends, you have to do something that kind of wraps everything up. Where does everybody go? Where do they end up? And you see this a lot on TV. So-and-so ended up in jail. So-and-so went to Tucson. So-and-so went to New York, whatever it might be. But you kind of get a wrap up of what happened to everybody and where they're at and why the book is ending at that point. Next slide, please. Okay, so kind of the basic structure, you have to understand what kind of novel are you going to write? How many words in a novel? Most of the novels that I've written, I've kind of aimed between 90,000 and 100,000 words. But a novel can be as little as 50,000 words in length or as much as 300,000 or 400,000 words, depending on the kind of novel. The novel that I'm writing right now, Julie's story, I'm estimating to be 75,000 words. But once you have made an estimate of how many words you need for that kind of novel, now what you want to do is divide it up into scenes. Basically, a scene can be anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 words. So some people like to write long scenes, some people like to write short scenes. I tend to go toward the short scene. So, for example, in Julie's story, I have 72 pages, 72,000 words. I divide that up, and 72 divided by 4 is what, 16? So basically, you put 16 at the beginning, 32 in the middle, and 16 at the end, and you kind of write it around that many scenes. Of course, that's not hard and fast. As you begin to write, you realize some scenes are very long, some scenes are very short. In Angel of Mortality, for example, I have some very short scenes where basically they're launching rockets carrying a plague into cities, or they're carrying eggs which have man-eating nanoborgs in them to places to plant them. Some very short scenes, but very dramatic scenes, because that's where the real threat to humanity and threat to the world takes place. So a book is basically composed of scenes. The scenes may or may not be the same length, but what you're trying to do is space yourself. You kind of want to have a rhythm to what you're doing. And when you have the number of scenes, of course, you know which scenes are the inciting incident, which scenes are the key event, which scenes are the first pinch point, the second pinch point, the middle. You're able to space your book out such that you can write it with an eye to what the outline is going to be. Because those key points are going to be what your outline basically is formed around. Now, I don't start out with a real in-depth outline. I start out with that kind of a structured outline, and then I fill in the meat, the gaps, as I kind of write the first draft. Then I may go back after the first draft and say, well, how do I really want this to flow? Because you have to have a flow that isn't going to be broken up in the middle and the end and so on like that. So I kind of space out my outline. I make a more in-depth outline. And now I get into the next slide, please. I get into how do you structure the scene. Each scene you have to start out telling the person or making it clear to the person reading in some way who is the point of view character, who's telling the story, where are they, what are they doing, what is their problem, how are they going to go about solving it, and what are the obstacles to solving that problem. So you have to understand all these things in the scene, and the scene is more or less complete in itself. It too has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning, the character's in this oh my God situation, how am I going to, what am I doing here? Where am I going to go? How am I going to handle this? In the middle, all the action takes place. And then at the end, the character says, I got done with that. And the next thing they look at is, I got this bigger problem. So scene to scene to scene, it kind of goes from a smaller problem to a bigger problem continuously until the main character is in deep trouble. And like Within the Wind, when that hurricane hits, they're underwater. They're treating this sick woman that they don't have the right equipment to handle. They have to keep electricity on. They have to keep watch on her. And right in the middle of all that, here comes the god of hurricanes down because he's got a bitch with the main character. And now Bonnie has to deal with him. So the book goes from one kind of action to another kind of action, but it ends up an action in the spiritual world. Next slide, please. So when you've written, as you're writing, and as you have complete writing, one of the things that really helps is to have a critique group, people who will look at this thing and tell you, David, that doesn't make any sense. You've got to do this or this or this. And you say, well, I'm not going to do it that way. But the group basically will look at your stuff and say, this isn't working, this is working, maybe there's a way to do this. It's the kind of a discussion group, but you're looking at the actual stuff you're putting on paper. And when you get around to where you've got a really good piece, if you have a good critique group, they begin to look at it and say, this is about ready for publication. And they're very good judges because they've been looking at it along with you at the same time you've been looking at their stuff. So it's a very good way to learn. It's a very good way to make sure you have good material. And it's, I think it's a necessity. And actually, when you finish a critique and you get where you think it's really ready to go, one of the things you can do is find a beta reader. And a beta reader basically reads the whole thing. And they're usually people who have read a great many of the same kind of novel. And they come back and say, well, this isn't Steinbeck, but it's pretty good. So, and here's some things I liked. Here's some things I didn't like. Good beta readers really help you. So all the time that you're writing this thing, somebody is looking over your shoulder and helping you determine whether it's really readable. You're not a good judge for yourself. And then, of course, eventually it goes to an editor. Next slide, please. Now, of course, of the books that I've written, and I'll describe each one, is Psychic Redemption. I've kind of described that, basically where Julie Gustafson comes back looking for her baby. The spirit of Julie comes back and possesses Bonnie McConnell, and Julie and Bonnie go off looking for who is the baby and where is she now. Next slide, please. And Within the Wind, I kind of described that. It's a Class 5 hurricane that hits directly into Cape Canaveral. It comes across Merritt Island, which is where Bonnie is isolated. She gets isolated by the storm with this woman who has a hantavirus, which is a tropical disease. And they fight to save her life. And all kinds of things happen during the storm, of course. A tree falls on the house. They have to refill the generator. They have to get there, and they have to use this rescue vehicle in order to get there. I'm going to discuss this in more detail in another session. But anyway, they really have to fight the wind. And all the time, what's regulating the wind is this spirit from the past that has a beef with Bonnie. Next slide, please. Okay, in Serious Consequences, what happens, the woman who was sick during the storm goes to the hospital, but she's in a coma. And her husband was a international crime figure. He turned himself into the FBI, so he's in jail. And when he did that, he sent her son up to stay with her sister-in-law, whom she doesn't like. So Serious Consequences, Aggie wakes up from the coma in a heap of trouble because also the federal government has frozen all of her assets. So she sets out to try and solve all these problems. And what helps her solve the problems is before her husband went to jail, he left a little secret thing on a thumb drive. And that's all the secrets of the mob that he was working for, an international syndicate. And she turns this over to Interpol. And as a result of that, she has to go to The Hague to testify to the International Criminal Court of Justice. And they put her under witness protection. While she's in The Hague, somebody makes an attempt on her life because she's putting some serious criminals in jail, people who are even government leaders in some countries. So they have to put her under witness protection when she comes back to the United States. And what happens is that eventually she totally loses her identity. Even her best friend doesn't know where she is or who she is. She can't see her parents. She can't see her husband. She can't see anybody. She is basically a whole changed, different person, isolated in witness protection, which is a consequence of the actions that they've done over the past 10 years. Next slide, please. I wrote this book, Cabrera Landing, and unfortunately it got a poor review and it wasn't legitimate. I talked to the person who gave the review. But this is about a man who goes back into 17,000 BC, Florida. And you wouldn't believe what 17,000 BC Florida was like. It was kind of before they drained the swamp, before there was a swamp. And there were a lot of animals around there at that time, saber-toothed tigers and dire wolves and things like that weren't around before. So when Leonard goes back with 5 other people from different areas of the past, they have to basically become primitives, living in this very, very primitive environment with all of these very, very primitive threats. And how do they get by? How do they get fire? How do they get water? How do they get food? And the entity that sent them back is basically a spirit from the cosmos that is basically playing a trick on them. But they have a devil of a time living in the past with no promise of ever returning to the future. And the ending is kind of a surprise, so I won't give it away. Next slide, please. Okay, after I wrote my novels, I basically decided I wanted to write a memoir. And the reason I wanted the memoir was 2 reasons. Number one, to kind of get into what old Florida was like before all the tourists started and the people after World War II started moving down. And also to talk about the space industry, which I was in for 40 years. I was lead engineer on the Mercury Atlas, the Project Mercury Atlas, the Project Gemini Titan, the Apollo Saturn, and on the space shuttle. So I wanted to talk about those space years because I was very deeply involved, and I think I have a different view than a lot of the stuff that gets out in the public. And that basically was a lot of what it was about. And then, of course, when I retired from the space industry, I had a whole different set of things. I started a business, a consulting business, and I had 9 employees. So I got the experience of being in small business, which I guarantee you is a lot different than working for a company or working for the government. And that basically is what it is about. And also it outlines my children. My daughter was murdered at 19 years old, which was a big event in our lives. And my son, who now is a IT specialist for the University of Florida up in Gainesville. And of course, my wife, who had a fascinating past. She was a dancer, a singer, and an airplane pilot, and all kinds of different things that she did with her life. So anyway, that's basic of my memoir, but it ends, of course, in about 2003, 2004, because I published it in 2014. Next slide, please. Okay, the most recent book that I've written is Angel of Mortality. Now, all of these books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Reader's Magnet. So if you want to get a copy of any of these books, that's where it is. Angel of Mortality is about Raisa Ilyushin, who basically invents something called a nanoborg. And that is a combination of the sciences of nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, neural networks. It's a combination of all the modern technologies, and instead of doing them separately, she basically puts them into one organization, which is practically alive. And this organism covers total continents and all the oceans. It's an enormous, enormous organism. And you can't see it because it's made up of nanobots and they're spread out. It basically is like a cellophane film that covers the earth. So all these books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Reader's Magnet. And I would suggest that you look at them, look at the description, and I'm going to go into some more of them. I have another session coming up on Wednesday. And I think at that one, I'm going to talk about psychic redemption. I'm not sure. But anyway, I will be discussing each of these books a little bit more detail in the sessions that follow on the Festival of Storytellers. Okay, well, I thank everybody for watching. I really appreciate having an audience to explain some of this to, but particularly my technique for writing, which you don't have to copy it all, but it's there. And I invite you to come to the session next Wednesday. And if you have any comments, they're able to pass them on to me. But I look forward to seeing you again. Oh, here's a comment from James Jackson. This is so cool. I haven't read books that feature nanobots. Yeah, they're kind of rare because a lot of authors are not scientists. I'm a scientist. I got my degree in physics from the University of Florida. So nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and robotics and smart materials, those are all technologies that are moving very rapidly at the moment. So keeping up with them, I take a lot of journals. I read a lot of papers. It's very difficult. So I certainly invite you to look at it from the technical aspect. What is my aspiration for my book? This is from James Jackson. The inspiration for Angel of Mortality actually came from a book that I'm writing that I haven't finished yet. And there was a international business owner who wanted a scientist to basically open the markets in the Central Asia. And somebody who worked for her in Singapore suggested that Raisa Ilyushkin would be the person to go to because she was working in all these areas that would probably have a good market in the future. So when I started writing about Raisa, I realized there's a story there. And that was really inspiration for me to start my book. I started writing about Raisa Ilyushkin. And the more I knew it, I realized there was a fascinating character, but on the outside, because of her past, being an Avdiivka during all the bombing, having an abortion in Russia, which was very difficult for her, moving from country to country. She's lived in Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. She kept a lot of stuff to herself on the outside, but on the inside, she's an interesting person. And it took a lot of work to try and make her interesting by getting inside of her mind and getting the reader to understand what was going on inside of her mind and her body, because she's not a person who shows a lot of her emotion on the outside. It was a challenge. And the one thing I love in writing is a challenge. The book that I'm writing right now, Julie's Story, it's about a 15-year-old girl who runs away from home and gets into the music business. It's very, very difficult to get the character just right. I know it will take at least 6 or 7 rewrites to get that story down the way I want it, and I'll probably change the title before it's done. But to me, that's what's fascinating about writing books, is getting into the characters. All right. Well, I believe that character development, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in another episode. Is going to be it's the crux of my books. There are really 3 kinds of books: event-driven or plot-driven books, character-driven or theme-driven. And I usually find the theme after I start writing. So what I start with the character, because I believe that's what people are really going to follow, is if they can identify with the character, if they can get into the character's soul, they will be much more interested in the book. So I will wrap this up now. I'm getting a caution here from Amy that I have 4 minutes left. But if there are no more comments, thank you very much for watching. Stay with the Festival of Storytellers. I know there's a lot of other authors around here who are very interesting to listen to and that you will be interested in. And I know there are a lot of books that are going to be presented that you will find something that will be interesting to you to read. Thank you very much.